Let's try a little experiment. I'm going to say a word, and let's see if somebody jumps into your mind that you think this word describes. You ready? Narcissist. Did you think of somebody? Maybe it was a boss, a sibling, an ex, a parent, a celebrity, maybe even a politician. It's a label that's used often these days, and is often misused and misunderstood. So in today's episode of the Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers Podcast, we discuss what narcissism is, the difference between narcissistic personality disorder and narcissistic traits, some theories on why narcissism develops, why we might want to have compassion for someone with narcissistic traits, therapies for narcissism, how to protect yourself if you find yourself in relationship with somebody with narcissistic traits, whether or not psychedelics could be a remedy for narcissism, and much more. For those of you who are new to the show, welcome. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus and is hosted by me, Dr. Steve Thayer, and my co-host, Dr. Reid Robison. A couple of announcements for you before we get into the episode. If you're looking for professional training pursuant to becoming a psychedelic-assisted practitioner, you can check out the courses we offer here at Numinus. Click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinus.com/training, and you can use the code PTF10 for 10% off selected trainings. If you've listened to the show for a while, you've likely heard Reid and I talk a lot about the psychedelic clinical trial work that Numinus does. If you or someone you know might be interested in being a participant in a psychedelic clinical trial, you can click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinus.com/research to learn more about the trials we're currently running. If you'd like to support our show, here's how you do it. Go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leave us a rating or review. We really appreciate those of you who have done that. We love getting feedback. If you're watching on YouTube, you can like the video, subscribe to the channel, or leave a comment below. And of course, if you found this episode fascinating, please share it with somebody who might also find it fascinating. Without further delay, here's our episode today about narcissism. Reid, a few episodes ago, we talked a bit about personality disorders. And remember, we didn't quite get to narcissistic personality disorder. So it's been banging around in my mind. Also, in today's day and age, where we're all chronically online, you'll hear accusations that so-and-so is a narcissist, so-and-so is behaving like a narcissist, or they're a psychopath, or what have you. So I thought it might be fun just to spend a little bit of time talking about narcissism, the personality trait, and maybe even narcissistic personality disorder, the diagnostic category, and we'll riff on that for a bit.
Who doesn't love talking about narcissism, right? No, I say that because it strikes me as one of the more triggering words in the world.
Yeah.
Or if you think about you as a clinician, or me as a clinician, or any of us as a human, like we have these biases towards working with, interacting with certain types of people. And I think this is one that frequently comes up. And yeah, so I guess my plea from the beginning, or hope, is that we can all kind of come out of this mini conversation about it just with a little more compassion for what led to an individual's narcissism, for narcissism as a thing that does happen, and not throw the label around lightly. Like, I don't use narcissistic personality disorder as a label on someone unless there has been a very thorough psychological assessment. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and the prevalence rates aren't super high. You know, if you look at least the stats cited in the DSM-5, 6% of community samples or so. I mean, it depends, and it's stratified by gender, but given how much it's thrown around, like you say, you'd think everyone was like 50% of the population was a narcissist. Certainly your ex-boyfriend or girlfriend is a narcissist. Certainly your toxic parent is a narcissist. Certainly your least favorite politician is a narcissist.
And I also need to make another disclaimer from the get-go, is just, I also understand that there have been people who have been so wounded by someone with these narcissistic traits, or carry around some really heavy burdens as a result of someone else's kind of narcissism and behaviors related to that, I don't want to make light of that at all. But I think there's room to hold both, right? To hold some understanding and compassion and boundaries.
Well, I'm glad you named both, because it's in a conversation about narcissistic traits or narcissistic folks, it's less common to invoke compassion for the person who's, has those traits, right? Because of what you pointed out, the two things we have to hold, that a lot of people have suffered at the hands of people with these traits. So
Yeah.
we'll do our best to hold both, and maybe, like you said, talk about some of the reasons why people might develop these traits.
Yeah, you want to try a little thought exercise, perhaps, that might help.
Sure.
So the word callous, right? And humor me for a second. If you Google the definition, it'll point you more towards from the noun to the adjective. But callous or calloused is a hardened part of the skin where sensitive, after repeated exposure to friction. And it seems to me that you could draw some parallels. Like, people aren't born with narcissistic personality disorder, although there are, like any kind of mental health condition, there are some genetic predispositions and risks, somewhere around the 50% heritability factor, complex genetics that might make someone more likely to develop it in the face of that repeated friction. And it develops over time, and it develops when the only thing that human can do is harden. And it also, so you basically build up this armor, and it becomes very hard to take off. But here's the exercise. So first of all, if you could humor me, Steve, and say, that guy is so narcissistic, narcissists drive me crazy.
Say that out loud. Mm-hmm. That guy is so narcissistic. Narcissists drive me crazy.
Just notice how that feels.
Okay.
And then we're going to try it, but replace the word narcissistic or narcissist with deeply wounded. So that guy is so...
That guy is so deeply wounded. Deeply wounded people, I forget the rest of it. Drive me crazy.
How's that land?
Not as well, yeah. Makes me feel like I'm being cruel.
Yeah, and...
Like, deeply wounded people drive me crazy.
Yeah, but in the end, like, you can swap them out, right? Mm-hmm. And that's why I point this out, is that there is room for compassion for someone's wounds and the other stuff we'll talk about of how to navigate it.
Yeah, the sort of genetic heritability component is always an interesting conversation. Mm-hmm. The sort of, are people blank slates? The nature-nurture conversation. We don't have to go down that rabbit hole, but I'm just imagining some people listening, especially people like you pointing out earlier, who've been really harmed by people with narcissistic traits, saying, aren't some people just born evil? Like, do we have to excuse all behavior saying that it's the result of wounding? And I don't know. I don't know the answer to, aren't some people just born evil? I'm not sure. But, and we'll get into later, some of the ways to protect yourself in situations where, you're in relationships with people like this. And to protect oneself doesn't mean invalidating the possibly tragic origin story of somebody's narcissistic traits.
Yeah, because it is hard to deal with, and there can be collateral damage. And also, it seems to me that that's a hard, heavy burden to carry for the individual who is deeply wounded with that callous that impacts how they show up in the world, with this kind of lack of empathy and constant need for admiration, this pattern of like grandiosity, if you will.
Right. Yeah. So I guess to the definition, you were listing some of the qualities of
the qualities
of narcissistic personality disorder. And we should make the distinction that there is a difference between narcissism as a personality trait or a tendency or a collection of tendencies and something that we would diagnose as a clinical disorder.
Like, to give you an example, if you have ever been in a relationship or seen one on TV, let's say, any of these, where someone says, you're such a narcissist, chances are they're talking about traits that showed up in that interpersonal dynamic and not necessarily a pervasive pattern across all areas of life.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction, right? Because you might have a boss that you think is a narcissist because of the way they show up, and they seem to be self-aggrandizing and self-congratulatory and focused on themselves. And then that person goes home and they're really compassionate with their partner or kids. Like that's possible, right? When you have somebody whose narcissistic tendencies are exclusive to a particular relational context. But when we're talking about personality disorders, these things are pervasive across contexts typically. And they usually, there has to be signs and symptoms early on in life, right? People who are diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder usually show signs early in childhood.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be. I think narcissism would be one that, is especially susceptible to that kind of slow hardening over time. But the interesting thing about narcissism, like as a phenomenon, let's say, is it is a normal part of child development. This is according to Freud, and I don't think many current prominent child development experts would disagree, is that, like, say around age 5 to 8, we don't really see it this way because they're cute kids and going through an experience of testing out selfishness on the world and whatever else. But then it is not normal to be present prominently in adolescence.
Right. Yeah. So being like preoccupied with one's own needs, you would expect that from a small child. They sort of need to, and you could, not hard to see the sort of adaptability of that as a small kid.
Or preoccupied with fantasies of unlimited power, success, brilliance, and whatever in yourself, or that you're special and unique. And we want the children to like embrace that, right? Like, and fantasize and all that. But it's a different stage and a very different context when we talk about adolescence and beyond.
Right. Yeah. And young children are maybe even not neurologically even capable of things like theory of mind and thinking about things through the perspective of others, and is likely necessary for survivability, like I was alluding to. So
yeah, I like, as a slight tangent, the term narcissism comes from Greek mythology, right? Narcissus, who
lots of S's today.
A hunter who fell in love with his own reflection, and eventually died of unrequited love because he was blind to the fact that it was just himself he loved.
Right. Yeah. So, which is suggestive of the disorder, right? A preoccupation of self. And this type of selfishness, it falls into this category of disorder because it's maladaptive. We use that word all the time on this podcast, and really disruptive in relationships, and speaks to what you're talking about earlier about how the burden that a person with this personality disorder lives with. Because, likely they want closeness. They want to be valued. And it's really hard to do because they're pushing people away with this, what people they are in relationship with might describe as toxic behavior.
Yeah. And where it often stems from, and it can come from any of these or a combination of them or other, but could be just like deep-seated inadequacy, shame, sensitivity, like we were talking about with the calloused definition. Like it's, there's an oversensitivity where this developed as a much needed protective armor. Yeah.
It's something that not a lot of people understand about narcissism, is the sensitivity part I really like this callous analogy that you're sharing, but maybe you've seen it if you have somebody in your life who sort of fits this description, and then they don't get what they want, or suddenly they're criticized, or they're embarrassed, or their faults are made obvious, and they sort of lose it, right? They get really, really activated, and they're very reactive in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting to look at, I once heard this, kind of the 4 Ds of narcissism from the lawyer community. It's just interesting how they see it in helping people navigate divorce, for example, is the 4 Ds or something like: narcissists will deny, they'll dismiss, they'll devalue, and the last D is you should divorce them, say the attorneys. They're also selling divorce, but that message becomes very important because when people are stuck in an abusive relationship with themes of codependency or like complicated dependency, where it can be very hard to extract from.
Yeah, your comment about the lawyers made me think of this interview with Bill Eddy on Huberman's podcast. He's a social worker turned lawyer mediator, and I'm trying to remember the name of the book. He talks about high conflict personalities, of which narcissism
I remember
is one.
listening to that episode.
Yeah, but it's maybe I'll take the time to.
He's like an East Coast fella, I believe, from his speech.
Anyway, the book I just wanted to bring because the book I haven't read the book, but the book title was interesting. It was like the number 5 was in it. Anyway, I digress.
I will throw out a book recommendation, though, while there's this open accidental invitation for one, is I've passed out this book from my shelf many a times. It's called The Knight in Rusty Armor.
I haven't heard of that one, actually.
You'd see copies of it laying around some therapy offices across the way there at Center for Change. I've seen it used in sessions even, or as homework, but it's by a guy named Robert Fisher, who was, I believe, a comedian, but he wrote this short little fantasy book as the magnum opus of his work, and it is damn good. But it's about a knight who is so obsessed with his knighthood and his knight quest that he just kind of becomes, he just becomes narcissistic appearing to his family, his wife, his child, and those around him. And then when he eventually, realizes he needs to get rid of this armor, this knight suit, or he's going to lose everything. Most of the book is about his quest through these different castles. It's a quest of getting off his armor that is rusted on shut, and by discovering some self-worth and how to communicate and how to some self-acceptance, and then eventually discovering love. But yeah, it's a good one.
I like that because it speaks to another thing that people often don't understand, is that people with narcissistic traits are not irredeemable. We talk about personality disorders. We often talk about how difficult they are to treat, how they're egocentric. People don't think they need to change, and probably true of narcissistic personality disorder. But when people have some self-awareness, often prompted by tragedy and being alone, and the realization may be painted in this novel, they can get help, and they can change.
And it's not a book about narcissism, but it is one about taking off our armor that I think applies to all of us, including and especially individuals struggling with this very hardened armor.
Right. So I did quickly Google the book title, 5 Types of People Who Can Ruin Your Life by Bill Eddy. Haven't read it, so I can't vouch for it, but man, damn, it's a catchy title.
Yeah, but it speaks to how pathological narcissism and interpersonal dysfunction go hand in hand. Birds of a feather, or they're just intertwined.
Yeah, sure, of course. So I don't know, maybe we can pivot to talking about different flavors of narcissism. I mean, we sort of outlined narcissistic personality disorder a little bit, but
do you want me to list off the 9 criteria just to
that'd be helpful.
Complete that? Where
put a button
where is, as typical in our diagnostic Bible, the DSM, and I say Bible facetiously a bit, is you need 5 of the 9, or any 5 of the 9 criteria, and they need to be present in a variety of contexts and cause that dysfunction, maladaptive, like you pointed out. But 1 would be a grandiose sense of self-importance. 2, preoccupied with fantasies of your unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty, ideal love. 3, a belief that he or she is special and unique, can only be understood or should only associate with other special or high status people. This is something that there are these what we call pathognomonic signs in psychiatry, hospital work, where a certain key behavior, like demanding a certain room, or a certain doctor demanding to talk to only this person in a certain way, can be pretty striking to set off the bells of, should I investigate this further? But number 4, a need for excessive admiration. 5, entitlement. sense of entitlement. 6, interpersonally exploitive behavior. 7, lack of empathy. 8, envy of others or a belief that others are envious of him or her. And lastly, 9, a demonstration of arrogant and haughty behaviors or attitudes.
Right. So yeah, you can imagine a person in your life who has one or two.
How many do you have?
Oh, all of them, for sure. I've been accused of many things, but narcissist isn't one of them. Thank heavens. But yeah, you can imagine somebody who has one or two of these qualities being difficult to be with. But one or two does not a narcissist make, or someone with narcissistic personality disorder.
Yeah. And I do use the concept of traits clinically too. Like there are some like symptom questionnaires that will collapse some questions onto this category of like borderline personality disorder traits and narcissistic ones, and where you can see kind of a signal like sub-threshold narcissism can still be problematic.
Right. Yeah. So that's narcissistic personality disorder. But if we broaden the spectrum a bit, and these different labels for different, as I call them, flavors of narcissism, most of them theoretical, like most of them not necessarily borne out by thorough research, although some of them, like you mentioned, some questionnaires that people use in research of this kind. So depending on what you Google or how thorough your prompt is for ChatGPT, you might get different labels here. But these are some categories with some distinctions that people have observed. So a difference between so-called overt and covert narcissism, for example. Have you heard this distinction before? Yeah. So as overt and covert imply, overt narcissism being the more obvious demonstration of narcissistic behavior. So they're typically outgoing, pretty arrogant. Maybe they're overbearing, braggadocious, this obviously exaggerated sense of self-image. These are the ones that are more likely to be sort of aggressive or exploitative. So you're hearing some of the things that we listed in the diagnostic categories as well. Sometimes lacking empathy, whereas covert and are also called like vulnerable narcissism. These are people maybe with more of the more neuroticism on board. They're a little bit more self-conscious, and they might have more obviously low self-esteem. Although the overt narcissist might have low self-esteem simmering underneath their grandiosity and inflated self-image. Higher likelihood to have anxiety, depression, shame, like you were talking about earlier, maybe more introverted and less extroverted, more defensive than the overt narcissist, so more reactionary, passive aggressive instead of overtly aggressive, perhaps.
You know what strikes me is even with the 5 out of 9 criteria, you can have many hundreds of different flavors of narcissism. But then when you layer on the things you're talking about, like introversion, extroversion, and how reactive you are, how defensive you are, all those things, depression, anxiety, you get even more varieties of the narcissism experience. So anyway, it doesn't, there are these common themes that give it its term, but it can show up in many different ways and many different origins.
Yeah. I mean, some of those common themes may be being that sort of pathological preoccupation with self and self-importance. And then you have other things that sort of layer on that can distinguish the different flavors, perhaps.
Yeah. Because when you get down to it, like individuals with narcissism struggle with emotional regulation as one, and they struggle with their capacity for empathy, and they struggle interpersonally. Like those, I think those capture a lot of the domains of problematic narcissism, at least in kind of categories of where they came from and how they mess up one's life.
Right. Yeah, I think those are good categories, good distinctions. One I came across that I wasn't familiar with before was this idea of communal narcissism. Have you heard of this one before? You could probably guess.
Like Texas Pride. No, I like Texas.
Or your favorite sport team, Pride.
Yeah. Or should we talk about politics?
Please no. Yeah, we're recording this the day before the U.S. election. I'm all politicked
Oh,
all politicked out. Although, I mean, it would be relevant for this
Donald,
this category.
not to mention names. No, it'd be, yeah, many have explored that question.
Yeah. Well, and I've often mused that politics is a thing that attracts people who perhaps we could describe as narcissistic. Not saying that every politician is narcissistic, but you're in the spotlight a lot. You have opportunities for power and influence over other people. You have to ignore accusations of your limits and downplay them and amplify and spotlight and maybe even be dishonest about
Makes sense.
the things that are good. Yeah. I mean, and this could be applied to any political party. I'm not being partisan here, but.
And any real kind of personality construct or mental emotional condition for that matter, you could see how, you might fit kind of much better in this complementary puzzle piece to your own kind of, I don't know, psychopathology, psychovariability, diversity, and gravitate towards different things where someone with strong narcissistic traits, there are certain roles they definitely would not do.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And because of their desire for power over others and to be loved and praised by the masses, the political positions or, positions of leadership in industry or business or whatever, they attract folks with narcissistic traits. So we probably have an overrepresentation at in government and the top of businesses of people with narcissistic traits would be my guess.
You know what doesn't attract people with narcissistic traits? Seeking mental health treatment for narcissism.
That's true.
It's just interesting to think about, like, the definition of it interferes with your ability to see it and ask for help for it. And often people present out of necessity or because they are sent there by someone or in a couples therapy situation, things like that. Not always, but there is a blindness that can interfere with access to treatment in a big way.
Right. Yeah. People who, those people usually are, if they find themselves in treatment, that's because they've been court ordered or their family wants them to go. And speaking from experience, they're sometimes really difficult to reach. But if you can help them see how their behavior is limiting their ability to get what they want out of life, closeness and success in one domain or another, then usually they're a little bit more open.
I used to get referrals to see doctors in trouble back in the day of probation with their license or whatever. And sometimes it was anger management issues like I remember a surgeon who threw something across the operating room. Spleen, I believe. It wasn't a needed spleen anymore.
He threw an organ across the room? Oh my gosh.
But yeah, I'm just remembering that because of how these kinds of things can show up. Or you hear about gaslighting all the time on TikTok or wherever. But if you look at some of those things of like the lawyer's 4Ds of dismiss and devalue and similar to BPD, people with NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, can be masters of misdirection, communication, of denying, even to the point of fooling themselves.
Yeah, maybe we should talk a little bit about, unless we want to talk about more flavors of narcissism, because you made me think of what is it like? What does it feel like to be in a relationship with somebody who has these traits? It can feel really, really fuzzy. You can feel like you're going crazy, especially if they are using, this strategy of gaslighting. They don't like boundaries. They don't like clarity around their intentions and the effect that they have on people. So if you've ever been in a relationship with somebody like this, whether it's a parent or, a partner or at work, you can kind of feel like you're going crazy. You feel devalued. You feel like you're an end you feel like you're a means to an end as opposed to them being in a relationship with you because they like you. And if you challenge them, they're often bewildered or angry. They might get reactive.
And makes you puzzled and second guess and confused.
Right.
Yeah, I'm glad you're bringing it up because related to that point of people with NPD not kind of readily seeking treatment, self-referring for it as a general rule. The people Googling narcissism, reading about it, or asking for help on it are usually those living with it.
Right. Yeah. And there's often this pattern where, and sometimes you see this with borderline personality disorder as well, but where a person feels initially like idealized by the person with narcissistic traits. And this can be confusing because like, oh, they're super charming, they're attractive, they seemed really into me. And then as time passes, it seemed to be less and less about me and more about them. And that's when the gaslighting happens. So that's one of the disorienting things, is that it's the red flags aren't always obviously red at the beginning of a relationship.
Because it strikes me as well as an important part of the conversation, I pulled one study that was specifically surveying former partners and family members of narcissists, and like looking for themes, and it was interesting to see the complex interpersonal themes that emerged of this mutual idealization and devaluation. You're like caught up in it because that is your world. Like, just like they're bringing you to the top of this glorious fantasy mountain you may not know as a fantasy mountain, bringing you there, kind of idealizing and like giving you the fantasy world, and then bam, like something goes wrong, even completely out of your control, and it can be turned on you and extra hard to extract from, extra confusing.
Yeah, it's a maddening cycle of hope and disappointment. And the hope keeps you stuck in it.
I can get better.
Yeah.
Whatever it is.
Or he or she could get better. Like, you have hope that they could get better too. And then the pattern continues, and your family's all telling you got to leave this person. They're, emotionally abusive, or in some terrible, tragic cases, physically abusive. And
because, and then because they show up in couples work as one of the main entries to treatment, or getting referred, like those sessions tend to be working on those like complex and really frustrated dependency themes, and establishing boundaries, especially around personal safety, like is key. And like just looking at that alliance and attachment to it, because it can be kind of mutually like really damaging.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up boundaries and safety, because a lot of times folks who are in these relationships, they feel, like we're saying, devalued and confused, gaslit. They can also blame themselves, especially if the person, I keep wanting to say narcissist, but I don't want to use the label as if it defines the human being. So a person with narcissistic traits, especially if they're really skilled at the gaslighting, a person can feel like everything's their fault, and if only they were doing the things that my partner was asking, then they wouldn't have to get so mad at me. You see some real Stockholm syndrome, so to speak, in some of these relationships, that when you've generated awareness around what's going on here, safety is the number one priority, the first and number one priority. And that could mean very clear boundaries. If they don't respect the boundaries, that could mean distance. That could mean physical distance, getting out of there, making sure that you're safe.
Yeah, and it's easier said than done sometimes for the individual who, if you think about it, however you entered into that situation, there's a bond. There's like, maybe you fell in love with this individual and there was a honeymoon period, and there is this deep kind of affection and hope, for it working out, and everything, all that you've invested in that relationship can be hard to fathom it in a completely different way all of a sudden when kind of the fantasy world cracks.
Yeah. For in some relationship contexts, absolute end to contact and relationship is what needs to happen in order for you to be safe. But In those other contexts where you're not going to end the entire relationship, maybe it's a parent, maybe it's a coworker, or maybe it is a partner, and you're not unsafe necessarily, how do you stay in the relationship and stay sane? And I think back to boundaries. And these are both internal boundaries, like what am I willing to feel and not willing to feel? What am I willing to let in and believe versus not let in and believe? And then external boundaries, like, hey, I'm not going to have these types of conversations with you. Like, we're not going to talk about X because when we do, Y and Z happen.
That can be extremely important when navigating like a co-parenting relationship after divorce or separation for a couple where there was narcissism and there was a split. Yeah. Because, I mean, there are ways of approaching it. Like some people have to do, like through others, communicating through others to avoid like just that one interaction that's going to open up a can of worms of stress,
right?
Or the revolving door cycle of just chaos.
Right. Yeah, and there are other things that could keep that revolving door revolving. I was talking about internal boundaries, one of which is letting go of your need to be liked by this person, which is, like you said earlier, either easier said than done. But if that's part of the dynamic where you really, really want to be loved, you want them to love you the way that you love them, you want them to see you the way that you see them, and it's just not on the menu, and you keep going back to the table over and over again, coming to terms with that. Like, I need to let go of this attachment so that I can move to safety, so that I can move to self-care, and step out of maybe what could be a codependent relationship.
Yeah, it makes me think of one of the treatment approaches, because in narcissistic personality disorder, like any personality disorder, like any condition, there are a variety of therapy paths you can take. And unfortunately, in some conditions, like narcissism, there haven't been like huge, well-funded studies, head-to-head comparisons of these. They kind of emerge over time, like the psychoanalytic approaches were kind of leading the way for decades. And Otto Kernberg, for example, did a lot to kind of pave the way for how to approach this. But now you have these other things like transference focused psychotherapy, where the individual, the client, is really sending those emotions to the therapist instead of their partner, and you're working with it in the here and now in that way. And you can see how that can be helpful for untangling some of those complicated attachment and identity issues for the individual living with it.
Right. Yeah, speaking of treatment, there's some curiosity around whether or not psychedelics would be helpful for people with narcissistic personality disorder or narcissistic traits.
Yeah.
When we were asked that question a couple times by some of our listeners, like, hey, what about psychedelics when we talked about personality disorders before? And I mean, if you think there isn't a ton of research on run-of-the-mill therapy for narcissism, almost zero on narcissistic personality disorder.
Yeah, I don't think you could find a pilot study out there in the universe, but cases, sure. The one thing that comes to mind for me is like when you are dissolving the ego or deconstructing it with a heavy enough dose of a psychedelic, it's going to get reconstructed, and you're going to flex that ego muscle back into place. And this is where the integration is really key. Like, you don't want to strengthen psychopathology, like even unknowingly, or I think there's a theoretical risk there, at least, of someone kind of doing repeated psychedelics on their and deepening their grandiosity, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I see it in clinical practice, and it's usually not the person whose grandiosity has been amplified by psychedelics that's coming to my office. It's the people that person is harmed or exploited, but
concerned about that person.
Right.
And it could be a flip into psychosis or mania or something, but it could be a slower strengthening, deepening of a really maladaptive thing like this.
Right. Yeah. And, you mentioned the callus analogy before. I like the idea, and this is just an idea, of if narcissism has developed as a callus in response to a wound, that if psychedelics can help a person get down to the wound and do some healing, that perhaps they don't need to rely on that particular pattern of defense. Like, again, I like that idea.
Yeah.
I don't have a lot of personal, if any, clinical data to support that idea. But.
So could it be useful for an individual with the right intention, the right mindset, and kind of bare minimum self-awareness going in? Like, if there's some acknowledgement of the concern and true sincere desire to get down to those wounds, great. Or to move towards vulnerability, sensitivity, peeling away layers of callus, great. And it would probably take more often than not, it may take some, extra integration and maybe extra doses along the way, like personality disorders that develop slowly. I think it's a safe assumption. We've seen it in other conditions that they, tend to untangle and fall off slowly with repeated heavy work.
Yeah. And you were mentioning some things that might need to be in place a priori that are difficult for narcissistic personality disorder in particular. And that one of those is openness, just like being open to the possibility that you're the problem and not everybody else, right? Mm-hmm. You're not the narcissistic victim and everyone else is the asshole. I'm not the asshole.
I was at the 2019 MAPS conference in Austin, I believe. If I'm remembering, it's been a while now, but Paul Stamets gave a talk at the end, and one of the first things he said was that he would like to give every politician and every U.S. president 5 dried grams of mushrooms. And it was just an interesting thought, interesting thing to play with of what would happen. And I think, it's a fun question because it gets to that question of how much does, setting and intention and the integration, the goals of it matter.
Yeah. I think I can say with relative confidence that psychedelics are not a personality panacea. They're not gonna make everybody lovely and and moral and ethical and pro-social. But yeah, interesting thought experiment.
Could they have saved the life of Narcissus in ancient Greece, perhaps?
Perhaps. Maybe Narcissus
we'll never know.
Needed some kykeon, needed to go to the mystery school and do some healing.
And the mystery school had the school part of it, the curriculum,
Yeah.
It wasn't just the special wine.
It was thorough. Yeah, it wasn't just the spiked wine. I'm forgetting the name of it. The kykeon, is that what it is? And then the school was the Eleusinian. Yeah, Eleusinian mysteries.
Yeah.
So
bring back the mystery school.
Maybe psychedelics, maybe not. Anything else on narcissism that we haven't covered? Looking at my notes. Oh, that was one last thing. You mentioned a book earlier. A book that I like to recommend clients is Talking to Crazy. And the author, I think it's Mark Goulston, he defends the use of the term crazy, meaning we all have a little crazy in us, and part of the book is evaluating your own chronic irrationality. But he has some good strategies, sort of brass tacks strategies for dealing with people who narcissism is one of which, of the many high conflict type conversational styles or personality traits. He talks about
that's a good one.
Different MOs of those people and what they're really after, and how sometimes in an effort to get what they're after, they can be really toxic or high conflict. But that's a good one, Talking to Crazy. Yeah,
I like that recommendation. And then, just thinking of the different therapy paths, we mentioned Kernberg briefly, but his would be an object relations approach, viewing narcissism as coming from like your early relations, the bosom of the family, if you will, where love, approval, care, being seen, all that good stuff, celebrated, held, is inconsistent. And then you develop this fragile self with a compensatory sense of grandiosity, like a facade of grandiosity around it. And the individuals, I think the psychoanalysts and Kernberg especially noticed that the individuals really struggled integrating anything negative and positive about themselves, too fragile to hold both. And so there's that kind of path forward, which, back in the day would probably mean twice a week of therapy, at least in a psychodynamic. And then there's an interesting one that's become more and more evidence-based in the borderline world of mentalization-based therapy. That there's even a paper on kind of suggesting it theoretically and why for NPD.
I don't know this. Is DBT used for people with NBT?
Yeah, I think, and I mean, you could probably find almost any therapy on some list somewhere,
Sure.
but DBT, I've seen on some of the short lists, and I think gets to that leg of the table you're trying to work on, that is that emotional dysregulation, mindfulness as non-judgmental awareness of what's going on could be a key, a game changer if you could embrace some of that.
Yeah, that makes
in
sense.
this, when you're seeing your reflection in the mirror instead of anyone else.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, folks, that's narcissism.
Okay.
Hopefully useful. Enjoy your week.
Thanks, Steve.
Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus, a mental wellness company committed to tackling the global mental health crisis by delivering best-in-class psychedelic-assisted therapies, contributing to the body of primary and clinical psychedelic research, and fostering healing through community connection and social responsibility. You can learn more about Numinus at numinus.com. That's Numinus.com. If you enjoyed the show today and you want to support us, here's how you do it. Rate and review the show on platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Subscribe to the Numinus YouTube channel, like the videos, and share it. Share the show or clips of the show with someone that you think will enjoy it. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Consult with a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.